Hi, welcome back. Thanks for joining us. Today, we are going to talk about a question that I have gotten many, many times. Can picky eating be prevented? So, I'm going to talk about kind of what causes picky eating and ways that we can proactively prevent picky eating from occurring. Um, so, but first, before I get started, if you are completely new to my work, I help parents learn how to get their kids to love food and move from fearful to excited and eager to learn about food, right? So that's sort of my mission here. Now, I just want to quickly introduce this topic, right? Picky eating, in and of itself, the words picky eating does not actually apply to most of the kids that we see and treat. Picky eating is considered a developmentally normal phase, right? And I've talked about this in previous episodes, but picky eating is a typical phase for certain um, developmental stages. So, specifically between 2 and 3 years old, between 4 and 5 years old, and between 5 and 6 years old, and between 11 and 12 years old. Okay. So these are phases of, they're correlated with phases of development. So if your child is developmentally delayed or cognitively delayed, these ages may then adjust, depending on where they are, where their developmental stages. But it's correlated with a typical phase in development where they're kind of exerting more independence, wanting more control, things like that, right? But these kids who are picky eaters, they will still be able to eat from a variety of different categories of foods. They're not going to be fearful, right? They're just going to be a little bit more selective about what they're choosing to allow into their bodies, right? Right. So the type of eaters we have, they are extremely fearful. They will not tolerate sometimes even looking at foods. They have a very limited number of foods, right? So, like less than 20 foods. They have trouble at birthday parties, going out to eat, going on vacation, right? There is a constant battle happening between them and food and you and them and food, right? That's not typical picky eating, right? That is something more. And most parents just don't know that it's something more. And no, it may not be ARFID. I know that is now a buzzword, but that does not mean that that's what your child has. I have a whole article on it. I have podcast episodes on it. Please listen to those if you are kind of toying between, does my child have ARFID? Do they not? I will try to actually link it below if I remember to do so. I'm going to try to make a note. Um, link our fit episode so that you can get that information. But back to picky eating, can it be prevented? And I would say if your child does not have an underlying issue causing the picky eating or really super selective eating, fear of foods. I've heard ARFID, I've heard pediatric feeding disorder, whatever you want to call it. The outcome and what we do are pretty much the same. But my recommendations are this. Okay, is there's a difference between whole foods like regular fruits and vegetables and processed foods. So processed foods, I'm talking about like puffs, Cheetos, chips, things that break down very easily. You want to, as much as humanly possible, give them the real foods. Do not introduce the processed foods to them. And here's why, right? So, processed foods are going to be easy for the jaw to break down, requiring minimal to no effort, versus the fibrous foods like meats and vegetables, even fruits, even though fruits are easier to break down than vegetables and meats, there's still fiber, right? The point is that we want their jaws to be strong. We want them to, from an early age, have this understanding that they need to work that jaw. They need to use that jaw to break down foods. Now, If you give them those two options between the harder to break down foods and the easier to break down foods, they're probably going to choose the easier to break down foods. And this brings me to my biggest regret as a mom is literally introducing my son to processed foods because, yes, of course, he started to prefer processed foods to the fibrous foods. Those started to drop off of his food list, right? And it's because every human on earth usually will to find an easier way that everyone wants to take the shortcut, take the easier way, right? It's human nature to want to make things easier or to do things that are easier, right? And that's not necessarily a bad thing. But what I'm saying is if we want our kids to be eating the whole foods, the second we introduce these processed foods, they are going to gravitate towards those and start to prefer those over these other harder fibrous foods, right? And you will see probably maybe by 18 months, maybe by 3 years, they are probably going to start dropping those foods and asking for the processed ones, right? And I think what happens over time is the muscles in the face actually start to atrophy or shrink, not a ton, but enough that it actually makes going back to those more fibrous foods more of a challenge after they've been eating the processed foods, right? So now, okay, now you reintroduce something like chicken or steak. Now it's, well, that's too hard. I'm not doing that, right? Um, the kids don't know that. That's not consciously what they're saying, but if it's too hard for them, they're going to reject it, right? So my best advice would be to keep them eating whole foods as much for as long as humanly possible. If it's possible to never give them processed foods, I don't even know if that's possible in today's day and age, right? There's going to be someone who has processed foods in front of them, right? They are everywhere. And I'm not going to say we never use them. We definitely use them as a tool, especially with kids who are only eating processed foods. We got to start where they're at, right? But just if you're trying to prevent your kids from being pickier, giving them the real thing is going to keep those muscles strong and in good shape and ready to go. Okay. I also would suggest number two is to expose them to variety early on. And as much as different foods as you can, and as many different flavors. So please don't limit to, bland foods with no spices in them. Please add the paprika, the cumin, the garlic powder, the onion powder. Okay. They say to be a little bit less liberal with the salts, right? With the babies, right? I think you can Google, I don't know the exact ratio of salt for infants, under one or whatever. But those spices are good. I'm not saying to give them the habanero ghost pepper sauce, but you definitely can expose them to more foods and more variety, and variety will breed appetite, right? So we want them to always have that good variety going and be interested in different flavors, and that also helps make them flexible. Now, number three, speaking of flexibility, the more home cooked meals you give your kids, the better. Because when you cook something at home, you make it a little bit different every time. And this is a really important and very good thing to have. Okay. Because what kids get hooked on with processed foods is the safety of it. It always looks the same, it always tastes the same because they are literally engineered to be exactly the same, right? That's their signature thing. There's literally chemicals in there that give it a very specific flavor that keeps kids coming back for more. That's a recognizable flavor, okay? When you cook from home, there's variety. Sometimes it's a little saltier, sometimes it's a little spicier, and that variety gives way to flexibility. So when kids are okay with these little changes, right? You'll notice a lot of very selective eaters, they like things from certain boxes or containers or brands or restaurants because there's familiarity in that knowing it's prepared a very specific way, okay? So you want to keep that variety going, and to keep the variety going, the best way to do that is through home cooked meals that shifts very slightly from meal to meal. Even if you're cooking mac and cheese, every time you cook mac and cheese, it's going to be, even if it's just a hair different, that does help. Okay. Now, let's acknowledge some exceptions here. Not all cases of picky eating are going to be prevented. And that is because if there is an underlying issue, okay, then they are still going to start dropping foods no matter what. Okay. So just know that you can do all of those things I said and still end up with a picky eater. And that just means that there's an underlying issue that you haven't noticed or addressed just yet. Right. So that's just what it means. So that's why it's important to understand the 4 pillars of feeding, right? The gut, the oral motor, the mindset, the sensory systems. Because if there is something off in one of those systems, it could still lead to picky eating, right? So, could be a tongue tie, right? You might be doing all the right things, but if that kid can't, they might have a real strong jaw, but if they can't move food around in their mouth and they're spitting food out, they just can't even swallow correctly, because of their tie is so restricted, they're still going to remove foods from their diet that are too hard. They're going to stick to easier foods anyway, right? So that's what I mean. So don't beat yourself up if you're like, oh, Christine, I did all of that and they're still picky. It just might mean that there's something that we missed. That's all. It doesn't mean it's the end of the world. Doesn't mean you're a bad parent. It doesn't mean you did anything wrong. There just might be something that we missed, right? So I just want to forewarn you that that could also be the case. In conclusion, it's not always totally straightforward, but if you stick with, those general guide points of, whole foods versus processed foods, keeping the variety, and cooking at home as much as possible, those home cooked type of meals that are going to vary from meal to meal, you will probably have a good, solid, robust eater on your hands, right? And know that even if you did all of that stuff and they still were picky, know that there's 4 areas that need to be looked at and evaluated to see if there's an underlying issue, right? The gut, sensory, mindset, and gut, mindset, sensory, and oral motor. So, please don't beat yourself up is what I'm trying to say. But there's 4 areas. I'll also link the 4 pillars video as well. So if you're not familiar with the 4 pillars of feeding, and you're like, oh, which one of those might be my kid? Listen to that episode and you'll get the information you need from there, right? So I'm going to link below, hopefully those 2 things, and we'll see you, in next month's episodes as well. Thank you so much for joining. And again, if you have questions, or want to join us in our Unlocking Meal Times, just go to the pickyeaterstest.com, take our 2-minute quiz and see where your child falls with food and what kind of an eater they are, so that you know what you need to learn to get started on your child's feeding journey to help them specifically move from where they are to the next step. All right, we will see you next time. Have a good and happy week.
Thank you for listening to How to Unpicky Your Picky Eater. To learn more about achieving your child's feeding goals, check out Christine's website at foodologyfeeding.com. And be sure to tune in next time to How to Unpicky Your Picky Eater.